안녕하십니까. 잠시 뒤에 여러분이 보실 영상은 약 17분 30초짜리입니다. 이 영상은 오늘 2021년 11월 13일 토요일 민주평화통일 자문회의 덴버협의회 유타 지회가 한국군 참전 용사와 그 가족들을 초청해서 오찬을 하고 통일강연회에서 브리감영대학교 BYU 부총장 브레이드 테일러 부총장께서 가평 전투에 대해서 설명하는 내용입니다. 여러분께서는 아마 그 가평 전투라고 하면은 캐나다를 비롯한 호주 영연방 국가들의 그 승전 전투 소식은 꽤 알고 계실 겁니다. 그러나 유타주 방위군 소속 200만 명의 군인들이 중공군 약 4,000명을 상대로 이 포병부대입니다. 213 포병부대인데 이 중공군을 상대로 이 격투 끝에 중공군을 물리친 얘기는 아마 아신 분이 그리 많지 않을 겁니다. 브레이드 테일러 부총장께서는 지난 3년간 한국에 나가서 봉사활동을 하시면서 리치필드에 사는 지인의 그 부탁을 받고 이 얘기를 조사를 하게 되었습니다. 그래서 이 지금 오늘 이제 17분 정도 말씀하시게 될 텐데요. 이 유타주 방위군 출신 그 240명의 이 군인들은 주로 유타주 남쪽 세인 조지, 시더 시티, 필모, 뭐 리치필드 같은 데서 이 구성되는 그런 그 포병 부대원들이었습니다. 놀라운 것은 그 많은 중공군을 상대로 전투를 벌였지만도 한 명의 전사자도 없이 몇 분은 뭐 다치긴 했지만도 무사히 고국으로 고향으로 돌아오는 그런 기적의 얘기입니다. 저와 함께 우리 브레이드 테일러 부총장의 가평 전투의 기적 얘기를 들어보도록 하겠습니다.
It's a small, beautiful small town in southern Utah. And the reason that I know anything about Gapyung is because of my family in Richfield. I had a Richfield friend who knew that I was in Korea. This is like 2 years ago. And they sent me an email and said, hey, there is a Richfield connected story that happened in Gapyung. And you've got to go to Gapyung and find this place where the miracle happened. So my wife and I went on a search. We got in our car and we left Seoul and we drove out to Gapyung searching for this site where the miracle took place. And it took us all day. We were looking and we couldn't find it and we didn't have directions. We were just searching. And we finally found this place. And it's not easy to find, but when we found it, we started, we read the story. I'll show you that. And we read the story and we both had tears in our eyes because the story is very touching about soldiers from Richfield, Utah, and St. George, and Cedar City, and Beaver, Utah, and Fillmore. So these tiny little towns. Let me show you. So the story goes back to 1950, to young high school boys, maybe college age, ages 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, that were, that were served. They were farmers. They were nongbu kajo. They were just farming families, and they lived in these towns. Fillmore, Richfield, that's where my family was. Beaver, Cedar City, St. George. And they were just farmers, and they volunteered in the National Guard. So these were not enlisted or professional or drafted soldiers. These were National Guard, but they were serving in the National Guard. Here's a picture. They're the Utah 213th National Guard Battalion. So they just go on weekends and they practice little military drills. But Korean War came and they were suddenly called into, this is one more side note. If any of you are members of the big church in Utah, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this 213th Battalion is a direct continuing descendant of the old Mormon battalion from Nauvoo, Illinois. So it's an interesting piece of history about this group. So back to my story. That's not the cup jockey's not supposed to be there yet. They went up to. Here, let me do it this way. They were called because of the Korean War to go and really be trained in case they needed to go into action in Korea. So they left southern Utah, they went up to near Seattle, Washington, and they were doing their drills, and they were, there's my little thing. This is an actual news clipping. They were so good at what they did, like they were the most effective, like smart, intelligent, hardworking that they had ever seen. They were honored as best in the business. Now, it's kind of like that old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. Because they were best in the business, they were called to go to Korea. They thought that the most would ever happen to them because they're National Guard is that maybe they'd go to Germany to be some kind of a backup to soldiers that actually went into battle in Korea. But they were deemed so good that they were sent straight to Korea. And they were a little bit scared. These are just young boys. These are high school and freshman and college age boys. But there they were in 1951, in the new year of 1951, they landed in Busan, South Korea, so at the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. And this is written. I gave this presentation to some of our missionaries in Korea, so a lot of the titles are in Korean. But they were different than other soldiers because these are all LDS or Mormon or Church of Jesus Christ soldiers. They didn't drink. The Korean people in Busan said, these are a different kind of soldiers. They don't drink, they don't smoke, they don't use bad language, they talk with really clean language. They don't try to womanize the women of Korea. They're just good boys. And they stood out as being good, clean people, and they were respected. But then the war in Korea got much more serious. It got worse and worse. The battle up north got worse. And so they were sent, where's my little arrow? They were sent from Busan up to Gapyung. And by the way, I didn't say, this is an artillery unit. So they were not trained to be on the front line of hand-to-hand combat. They were trained to provide ammunition and supplies to the people up on the front line. But this is where the story happens. On May 26th, 1951, they were attacked. And they were never supposed to be attacked because they were supposed to be the support people from behind. But there was a miscommunication, and they didn't have cell phones, and they didn't have a lot of the communication that we have now. So there was a miscommunication, and they were lost. They were alone at Gapyung, and the people that they thought were in front of them were gone. Miscommunication, and they're attacked. Here's a picture. This is Gapyung. This is the valley of Gapyung. Chalmot-den Jungbu, so bad communication. This is the Utah 213th in Gapyung. And the number of soldiers is exactly 240. 240 soldiers. They were attacked by 4,000 Chinese and Bukhan, the North Korean soldiers. Okay, so I want to ask you a question. Can you picture what 4,000 against 240 looks like? Sang-sang he poseo. Imagine what that looks like. I made a little graphic for the young people that I presented this to. This is 240. I counted each one of those little people. This is exactly 240. Now, that is 4,000. That's the attack that these Utah soldiers faced. That gives you a picture. How could any one of them live, right? They're all dead. Wouldn't you assume I'm dead? I'm being attacked by 4,000. They fought like crazy. They fought with courage and with a great deal of faith. They just fought their hearts out. Let me show you something. This is today in Gapyung. This is the monument to the Utah soldiers. And you see, this is a Utah soldier. That actually says, praise to the Utah soldiers. This is a book with a carving, with words carved onto the book that tell the story of this attack. And I'm going to read you, there's another look at the book. This is what the book says in Korean language. I did bring an English copy. And I'm just going to read it. Pull this out and I'm going to read it, because that's going to be hard for you to see. On May 26, 1951, 240 of Utah's 213th Field Artillery Battalion were left without protection due to a miscommunication and came suddenly under attack of 4,000 Chinese and North Korean soldiers in Gapyung. The Chinese launched a vigorous attack. During the early morning hours of the 26th of May, the fight for survival was ferocious. The Utah soldiers fought desperately and courageously in hand-to-hand combat. Captain Ray Cox of St. George, Utah. Captain Ray Cox led a combat patrol using a 105 millimeter howitzer machine gun loaded up on top of a truck as a makeshift tank. The patrol hurtled down the valley, destroying numerous Chinese machine gun nests and inflicting many enemy casualties. The Chinese and North Korean opposition finally withdrew. They retreated, and they attempted to climb back up over the surrounding mountains under an intense barrage of artillery fire. The devastating gunfire convinced many of the Chinese and North Korea that escape over the mountains would not be possible, and they turned back and surrendered. 350 North Korean and Chinese soldiers were killed. 830 Chinese and North Korean were taken prisoner, and not one single Utah soldier lost his life. They all lived. It brings a tear to my eye. It is an amazing miracle. How can you imagine 4,000 attacking 240 and not one soldier dies? I mean, I view it as a miracle from God, and one that protected. This was a battle that turned the tide in the Korean War to save South Korea from communist attack. So it's not only a miracle battle, but it's a miracle in the context of all of the Korean War in terms of saving a free South Korea. 240 fight against 4,000 and not one dies. 정말 기적입니다. It's a miracle. They interviewed some of the Chinese and North Korean prisoners that were taken prisoner. Later, they were interviewed by CBS, Edward Armour of CBS television. And they said, what happened? How could 4,000 lose to 240? And this is in Korean, but they say, oh wait, here's the English. We shoot them, but they don't fall down. So in their broken English or in their Chinese or in their Korean language, they said, we keep shooting them, but they don't fall down. One interesting backstory to this, these 240 young soldiers. Now this is sort of a religious part, so forgive me. I'm not going to give a religious sermon, but there's a spiritual aspect to it. This church leader, before these boys went away, because they're just young boys, so he gave a talk to them, kind of like a church talk, and he said, if you will be faithful to the church teachings that you've been taught, if you'll be clean, and even when you go to Korea, if you'll be clean and honorable, I promise you that God can protect you. And so they went and they lived this clean and faithful life, and truly, God did protect them. In Korean, we call it sunjong. They were obedient to what they had been taught as they were children growing up. The other aspect was, they didn't know, sorry about the Korean, but they didn't know anything about Korea. Imagine, these are boys growing up in Richfield, Utah. They've never even heard of Korea. They don't even know where on the map is Korea. They've never even heard of until they were soldiers, they didn't hear about the Korean War. They, let's see, what's another one? But they had faith in God, and they had faith in their leaders, and they had a belief in fighting for freedom. Hubert said freedom isn't free. And that is a belief that they had. They were taught freedom is not free. You have to pay a price. You have to be willing to sacrifice to keep freedom in the world. And they believed that. So their second word is Shinan, which is faith. They had a deep faith that if they did right, that somehow God would protect them and would protect a free South Korea. One other aspect is this great leader. He's from Cedar City, Utah, Frank Daly. He called these boys his sons, and he took care of them like family. He's an amazing story, but the one point that I want to make is he knew these kids. He knew them before they were soldiers, and he knew their parents, and he knew their families. And he had this feeling that if any of these boys died, that he could never go home and face their parents again, that he would then he'd said, I would have to die in Korea in shame. I have to take care of these boys. And so he lived his military leadership with a great faith. And later, I'm kind of out of order here, but later he received from President Harry Truman the Presidential Medal of Honor for his leadership in the Korean War. But he had this tent, and he had a signal. This is his tent in Korea. And his signal was, when my flag is up, that means I'm taking time to pray and to try to get inspiration from God on how to take care of these young kids. And his flag was up a lot, and he prayed a lot for the guidance and the inspiration to know what to do. Let's see. And, well, this relates to a church story that's very similar, where soldiers, young soldiers, fought in these battles, and not one of them died. So there's kind of another kind of LDS church connection. But I'll go to, here's that book. This is from the other picture taken from the other side. Here's that book that I showed you. Here's the Utah soldier. And here's this beautiful, huge stone with the words written, "Freedom is not free." And I think that is the ultimate lesson from Gapyung, is freedom isn't free, and that these soldiers who didn't know anything about Korea were willing to sacrifice their life for the freedom of their Korean brothers and sisters that they had never met. I'm almost done. One last thing is, again, thinking about Seoul, Korea, 1953, for example, when it was very devastated, right? There were bombings and bombs. And even when I arrived to Korea in the late 70s, I still saw buildings that were bombed down, and Korea was in the process of rebuilding their country. But this is Colonel Dan Roberts. He's from St. George, Utah. He is one of the soldiers of the 213th. And I talked to him. He's a very old man now. But he said that he took a group of these original soldiers back, like 50 years later. He took them back to Korea as old men to see Gapyung one more time before they died, because they're all turning 90 years old. Many of them are already dead of old age. But he said, when we landed at the airport and a bus drove us into Seoul, we all started to cry, because when we saw the beauty of Seoul and the beautiful city that it is today, we felt that we realized what we were fighting for. We realized that the freedom that we fought for in Korea has turned into this beautiful, shining city of Daehanmingu, South Korea today. He says, this is the view we saw when we all started to cry. Because we realized that freedom was something that we really did fight for. And we fought for an amazing, beautiful South Korea today. So it was a moving moment for them. This is my friend Chae Sun-sung, Hwejangnim. He's the president of the Gapyung Memorial today. And he loves the Mormon soldiers. And he holds the memory of the miracle at Gapyung deep in his heart. So when we came out as church missionaries to visit the site at Gapyung, and we brought all of our young missionaries with us, he presented us with this plaque because he's so grateful to the Mormon church and to those Mormon soldiers from 1951. And then this is my last slide, I think. I was still in Korea on May 26th of 2021, this year, and it was the exact 70th anniversary of the miracle. And so we went out with a bunch of people, and the government leaders of Korea and military leaders of Korea, and even American commanders and embassy leaders, and the governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, all participated in this great 70th event. And a lot of people said words. I got to speak in Korean for a few minutes. And it was a special moment. We all shed a tear at gratitude for people who have sacrificed everything to keep freedom around the world, and especially in South Korea. So that was a very special day. Oh, and one last thing. This really is the last slide. One person who attended the memorial on that day was a writer for the Jungang-ilbo. Who here has heard of Jungang-ilbo? It's the biggest newspaper in South Korea. So he attended this event, and then he wrote a 2-page, this size and then another one, 2-page story about the miracle at Gapyung. And his story, if you want to ever search it on the online version of the Jungang-ilbo, you can read a very touching rendition of this that's published in that newspaper. I will stop right there. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions. But I'll end again the same way I started, by saying thank you for your service. Thank you, Hubert, for putting together an event that reminds us of great service. And I'm just honored to be here. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't talk too long. Thank you.